At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton lay crouched in a muddy drainage ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a German armored scout car roll steadily toward him at roughly 15 miles per hour. He had no mines, no grenades, no bazooka, nothing officially approved for stopping armor. All he had was a length of rusted barbed wire wrapped around the handle of a shovel, a device every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him to use. In the next minute and a half, that improvised trap would append doctrine and save an entire American company from destruction. According to U.S. Army field manuals, there were 16 authorized ways to disable light armored vehicles. Dalton's idea wasn't among them. Battalion command had already threatened him twice with court-martial for unauthorized field modifications that endangered personnel, but regulations felt meaningless after watching 11 men die in 3 weeks because the approved solutions required equipment his unit simply didn't have. Dalton pulled the wire tight. Morning fog hung over the Leary Valley like soaked cotton. He could hear the German vehicle's engine grinding through its gears. The commander's hatch open as the officer scanned for the American positions everyone knew were nearby. The wire quivered in Dalton's hands. He would get one chance. Jimmy Dalton grew up in Gary, Indiana, the son of a U.S. steel blast furnace worker, pulling 15-hour shifts just to keep food on the table for 6 children. Jimmy was the middle kid, the one who skipped school to spend afternoons in the rail yards, learning which train cars carried what, which couplers failed most often, and how to patch broken systems with scrap metal and wire. By 17, he was working as a switchman. The job taught him to think in systems, how one small failure could cascade into catastrophe, and how improvisation often mattered more than perfect equipment. When Dalton enlisted in January 1943, the recruiter promised training, steady pay, and travel. What Dalton got was 8 weeks of rushed basic training, a rifle he'd barely fired, and a ship to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy in September, he'd already learned how hollow those promises were. The 34th Infantry Division fought its way north like a grinding stone, every village contested, every ridgeline fortified, every river crossing paid for in blood. But more Americans were dying from German reconnaissance than from full assaults. Light armored cars prowled U.S. lines at dawn and dusk, marking positions and calling in artillery hours later. The Germans favored the SDK FCD 222, a fast, 4-wheeled, open-topped scout car armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34. It was quick enough to escape, armored enough to shrug off rifle fire, and agile enough for roads heavy tanks couldn't use. They appeared suddenly, sprayed American positions, then vanished. Doctrine said to counter them with bazookas, mines, or anti-tank rifles. Reality was harsher. The entire division had fewer than 10 bazookas. Anti-tank rifles were obsolete. Mines were reserved for fixed defenses. So the scout cars kept coming, and soldiers kept dying. Dalton watched it happen again and again. Private Eddie Kowalski died on February 18th when a 222 rolled past his foxhole at dawn. His rifle rounds bounced uselessly off the armor. The machine gun answered. He was 20 years old. Sergeant Mike Brennan was killed 5 days later trying to throw a grenade from 30 yards. He missed. The autocannon didn't. Brennan had taught Dalton how to read terrain and survive Italian mud. Corporal Luis Vargas died on March 4th when a scout car tore through the company position at dusk. Vargas had shared cigarettes even when he had almost none left. By early March, 47 men had been lost to reconnaissance vehicles alone. Dalton knew many of them personally. Every death felt unnecessary. Command's response never changed. Hold position, conserve assets, await resupply. After Vargas died, Captain Morrison gathered the company in a barn that reeked of wet wool and cordite. New bazookas were coming, he said. Until then, follow protocol. Dalton had been thinking for weeks. The scout cars always used the same roads. They moved fast, but predictably, and no one was exploiting their biggest weakness, the wheels. What if we ran wire across the road? Dalton asked, low enough to catch the axle. Morrison shut him down instantly. Unauthorized obstacles. Risk to friendly troops. End of discussion. Dalton didn't argue, but he didn't forget either. On March 10th, after another scout car killed 2 more men, Dalton decided he'd had enough. That night, alone and without permission, he took 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 entrenching shovels and slipped out toward a dirt road the Germans used daily. He chose a narrow stretch between 2 oak trees. He drove the shovels deep into the mud on opposite sides of the road and stretched the wire across at 14 inches axle height, not too tight, not too loose. He buried it just enough to hide it in low light. Then he waited. At dawn on March 12th, Dalton heard the engine before he saw it. The scout car emerged from the fog at a steady pace, commanders scanning casually. They weren't expecting resistance. At 6:47 a.m., the front wheel hit the wire. The axle locked instantly. Momentum did the rest. The vehicle pitched forward, flipped, and rolled violently down the road before landing upside down in a cloud of mud and twisted metal. Dalton ran. The commander was dead. The gunner trapped. The driver surrendered immediately. The wire was still wrapped around the axle. Dalton removed it and disappeared it before anyone could ask too many questions. Captain Morrison arrived minutes later, puzzled but satisfied. The scout car was destroyed. No Americans were hurt. He didn't press further. That night, Dalton quietly showed one trusted friend how it worked. Within days, others learned. No orders, no paperwork, just soldiers teaching soldiers after dark. More scout cars flipped. German patrols slowed. Routes changed. Artillery strikes dropped sharply. Casualties plummeted. By April, German reconnaissance effectiveness in the sector had collapsed, though no one officially knew why. When Captain Morrison finally caught a private installing a wire trap, he didn't shut it down. He documented it, quietly, carefully. Higher command rejected the method on paper, but never enforced the order to stop. By summer, the technique had spread across the Italian front, passed by word of mouth. It was never credited, never officially endorsed. After the war, Dalton went home to Gary, Indiana. He worked the rail yards for 4 decades, married, raised children, and never spoke much about Italy. Only years later did historians connect the dots. Even then, Dalton asked that his name be left out. He died in 1987. His obituary mentioned nothing remarkable, but the method lived on. By 1949, wire obstacles at axle height were officially adopted into U.S. Army doctrine, credited vaguely to field observations in Italy. Modern militaries still teach variations of the same principle. The simplest solutions often come from the lowest ranks from soldiers. Who can stand watching their friends die and are willing to risk punishment to stop it? That's how innovation really happens in war. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video, subscribe for more untold histories, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from.